Okay, welcome to our very first video lesson of our 8th grade math school year. As you know, math is everywhere, and what we're talking about today in math are numbers, of course, but what kind of numbers? Today we're talking about rational numbers. What is a rational number? A rational number is any number that can be written as a fraction. Any number that can be written as a fraction is a rational number. So there are some numbers that are not rational, but a number that is rational looks like a fraction. Here's some examples. 2/3 is a rational number because that is written as a fraction, right? Okay. -1/111th is a rational number. So negative numbers can be rational as well, as long as they can be written as a fraction. Now, the number 7 doesn't look like a fraction, but it's still a rational number because can't you write 7 as 7/1? Yeah, it's 7 wholes, so it is still a rational number. So what you're thinking now is, okay, any whole number is a rational number, and any positive number or negative number that can be written as a fraction or as a whole is rational. And you're right. So -17, that's a rational number as well because you could write that as -17/1. Finally, 0.25 is a rational number. Okay, so you might be thinking now, wait a second, fractions are rational, whole numbers are rational, positives are rational, negatives are rational. What isn't rational? Well, there are such things as irrational numbers, but we're not worrying about that today. We're just talking about rational numbers. By the way, how is 0.25 a rational number? Well, you can write it as a fraction. You wouldn't do it like this because you wouldn't mix a decimal and a fraction like that. But isn't 0.25 a quarter? Like a quarter, like a fourth? Oh, and 1/4 is the same thing as 0.25. So that number is a rational number as well. The key word here is fractions. Rational numbers can be written as fractions. They don't always look like fractions at first, but as long as you can write them as a fraction, then they are rational. Okay, I think we got that. So here's your first practice problem, and you're going to do this in your math journal. Make up an example of a rational number. Now, go ahead. Write a number in your math journal that's a rational number. Okay, I'm going to trust that you got that because that's pretty easy. So let's move on. Under the topic of rational numbers, we need to talk about taking fractions and converting them to decimals. So anything that starts as a fraction is a rational number, and then you can turn it into a decimal from there. So grab your calculator. Let's get ready to roll. To turn a fraction into a decimal, like let's say we want to turn 3/4 into a decimal. Some of you already know what the decimal version of 3/4 is. That's great. But what you are going to do is you're going to divide the numerator by the denominator. In other words, we're going to do 3 divided by 4. So when you do 3 divided by 4 in your calculator, you get a certain answer. Or you could do it by hand, and you could do 3 divided by 4, do long division. How many times does 4 go into 3? No times. Put the point where the point is. Line it up. Now it's 4 into 30, which goes in 7 times, which makes 28. And you subtract, and you bring down the 2, and then you bring down the 0, and then 4 goes into 25 times, and that gives you 20, and there's no remainder. So the answer is 0.75. Of course, you could have done that a lot more quickly and easily on your calculator, and that's perfectly fine. But the point is, to turn 3/4 into 0.75, we just did 3 divided by 4. So the fancy way to say this is do numerator divided by denominator. But the gist of it is, just do top divided by bottom. Punch that into your calculator, and these kind of problems are really easy. So, as an example, if you did 1/5 as a decimal, here's what you would do. 1 divided by 5. And it comes out to 0.2. So 0.2 is your answer. Pretty easy, right? You could do these problems really quickly. How about 17/20ths? All we have to do is 17 divided by 20. Try it on your calculator. See what you get. If you did it right, you should get 0.85. Just make sure you do top divided by bottom and not bottom divided by top. How about 17/9? Even if it's an improper fraction, this still works. 17 divided by 9, try it. And if you do it right, you should get, can we write that as a decimal? With all those 8s that go on forever and ever and they take up the whole screen of your calculator? Yeah, you guys know how to write that. You put a little line over the 8 to show that it's a repeating decimal. A repeating decimal just means that there's a bunch of 8s forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Now, some decimals repeat like that when you divide the top divided by the bottom, and some don't. On the 17/20, that didn't have a repetition. It just ended. And so we call it a terminating decimal, because to terminate means to end something. And so 0.85 is a terminating decimal. It has an end. And 1.88888888888888 forever is a repeating decimal. So you use a little line over the 8. I think this is review, but just to make sure, try converting 7/8 into a decimal. And then, did you get a terminating decimal or a repeating decimal? Write down terminating or repeating. All right, just one more. How about 14/15? Top divided by bottom. What are you going to get? And is it going to give you a terminating number or a repeating number? Okay, once you got that done and written in your math journal, we've got to go the other way. We've got to take a decimal and turn it into a fraction. We turned a fraction into a decimal, but we're going to do the same thing just backwards. So, before we do that, we've got to remember how decimal places and digits work. I think you know that that's the 10 spot and that's the 1 spot, and you learned this a long time ago in elementary school, but this is the 100 spot, and the 2 is in the 1,000 spot. But what about the 6 and the 7 and the 8 over there on the right side of the decimal? Oh yeah, the 6 is in the 10th spot, and the 7 is in the 100th spot, and then the 8 is in the 1,000th spot. So we would say that there are 6/10ths, and there are 700ths, and there are 8,000ths. And that makes turning a decimal into a fraction really easy, because if you have 9/10ths, you have 9/10ths. So to turn a decimal into a fraction is really easy if you just remember your decimal digit spots. Okay, so to change a decimal to a fraction, use tenths or 100ths or 1,000ths. And then sometimes you need to reduce. Like if you had 0.8, that's an 8 in the tenths spot, so it's 8/10ths. So we put 8 over 10, but 8 over 10 can reduce to 4/5. So make sure you always reduce with fractions. What about 0.73? There's a 7 in the tenths, but there's a 3 in the hundredths. Oh, that's 73 hundredths. And 0.44 is 44 hundredths. But you got to reduce it. So reduce it when you can. It even works when you've got a whole bunch of digits there. What is this going to be? It's going to be 899, not tenths, not hundredths, but thousandths. And so turning a decimal into a fraction is actually really, really easy as well. So try this one. Turn 0.65 into a fraction. Well, that's 65 hundredths, but you can reduce 65 hundredths into 13/20ths. And the way that you do that, in case you don't remember, is you can divide the top by 5, and you can also divide the bottom by 5. And so when you divide the top and the bottom by a common factor, you get your reduced fraction. All right, this one you're going to do on your own in your journal. What is the fraction version of 0.3? And then after you've done that, what is the fraction version of 0.25? All right, there's one last thing we've got to cover, and then we'll be done with this lesson, and that's repeating decimals. We saw an example of a repeating decimal before, and it was 1.88888888. But let's just say you have just 0.8 repeating. Now, normally we would say that that's 8/10ths, because the 8 is in the 10th spot. But there's a bunch of 8s after that, right? Because there's repeating 8s forever. So we can't just say it's 8/10ths. Here's how you deal with repeating decimals. To change a repeating decimal into a fraction, instead of using tenths and hundredths and thousandths, we're going to use ninths and 99ths and 999ths, etc., etc., etc. So this 0.8 repeating isn't going to be 8 tenths, it's going to be 8 ninths. And to verify that 0.8 repeating really does equal 8 ninths, try doing 8 divided by 9 on your calculator if you want to, and you'll see a bunch of 8s repeating forever. So this is a nice little trick. You can use it on any repeating decimal. 0.3 repeating is not 3 tenths, but 3 ninths. And then, of course, reduce. And 0.17 repeating, 1717171717, it's not 17 hundredths, it's 17 99ths. Really quick, really easy. And now we know how to turn any decimal into a fraction, any fraction into a decimal, and we're all good with rational numbers. So try to convert 0.repeating 6 into a fraction. And this will be your last problem on your math journal. Oh, did you see that? All right, we're done. So I hope you learned something. I hope you wrote some stuff down in your math journal. And if you have any questions during these videos, you know what you should do? You should pause the video and rewind it and watch it again. And then if you still have a question, you should write that question down so that we can talk about it the next day in class. All right, thanks for listening. See you later.